Welcome to Healthy Relationships for Youth, Session 8, Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity. Sexuality and gender influence the way we are viewed by society, as well as many of the ways we interact with each other. Everyone has a sexual orientation and gender identity, and both of these can develop and change. While facilitating, it's important to remember that this is a conversation that relates to everyone. However, it is also important to recognize what is dominant and what is marginalized. It can be helpful to think of sexual orientations and gender identities as more common versus less common. We don't think of people who are left-handed as not normal. However, it is less common than people who are right-handed. The same should apply to thinking about people who identify as straight versus people who identify as bisexual, gay, lesbian, pansexual, asexual, or any of the other many sexual orientations that explain how people are attracted to one another. However, we currently live in a world where most of the messages we receive about sexual orientation are about straight people. This is referred to as heteronormativity. Most of the messages we receive also assume people to be cisgender, meaning the same gender as the sex they were assigned at birth. For example, someone is assigned male at birth and continues to identify as male throughout their life. Although we would like to believe we currently live in a world where homophobia and transphobia are being challenged, students in schools and citizens across many nations are still bullied, excluded, and physically harmed for who they love or how they portray their gender. As youth facilitators working through this session with the grade 9s, we want you to know that there might be some resistance to talking about sexuality and gender in the classroom. This can be discouraging and stressful, but it's important to know that even if this session leads to some difficult conversations, these conversations are important to have. By starting these conversations, you are starting to open up people's understandings of gender identity and sexuality, and by addressing homophobic or transphobic comments in this session, you will be supporting anyone in the room who might identify as queer or trans, as well as working to educate people on these topics. Before this session, it might be helpful to refer to some of the facilitation tips on the HRY blog. This session uses a human rights outline to discuss why gender and sexuality expression are basic rights that all people should be able to enjoy and explore without fear of violence. Homophobia and transphobia contribute to violence in huge ways within our personal relationships and our communities. By learning more about gender and sexuality, we can begin to have conversations which view all people as worthy and valuable and challenge the violence directed towards people who are not straight or who do not have traditional gender expressions. People often think that folks are just making up words to describe their gender and sexual orientations, and that these labels are talking about brand new concepts. That's just simply not true. Examples of people who identify as genders other than female or male can be seen throughout history. For example, before colonization, many North American indigenous cultures recognized people who did not fit into the gender binary. The term two-spirit is used today by some indigenous people to describe their sexual, gender, and/or spiritual identity and recognize these identities that were erased by colonialism. The terms people use to describe their gender identity and sexual orientation are continuing to evolve and will likely continue to shift and change as people continue to fight for their rights to freedom of expression. It's best not to get too tied up in the words and think more about how fundamentally people should have the right to express their gender and sexual orientation free of fear. However, it can also be helpful to have a handle on some of the key terms, so if you're having difficulty understanding some of the different terms used in this lesson, please watch the following examples to help your understanding. Thanks so much for listening so far. Have a great session.